that can be a stepping stone to eventually recapture that right to strike, which we're going to need for future contracts, but we're also going to need to defend our job if the forces of privatization strike a blow.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We have Rob in the Zoom, really excited for this conversation. Rob Darakjian, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, is a member of the National Association of Letter Carriers, Branch 2902. He is also a member of the coordinating committee for the Reform Caucus within the NALC, Build a Fighting NALC. Rob, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jacob. How are you?
I'm doing great, brother. How are you?
Very, very good.
Good. It's good to have you on. Really appreciate it. And so, I guess the first thing before we start talking about the strike and the strike in 1970 and maybe what lessons that we can learn from this, and particularly what lessons letter carriers can learn from this, can you talk to us about your history in the union? What, how did you get a job at the Postal Service? What made you want to get a job at the Postal Service, and what made you want to be involved in the union?
Sure. So, I've been a letter carrier since 2022 in August, and it's been about 2 years. I was inspired to get a job by my friend Tyler Vassar, who was working in Minneapolis at the time, and at the time it was just a job. I wasn't looking to transform the NALC at the time. I just wanted to work there, and quickly realized that I would have to get involved in this fight if I wanted to keep this career for myself.
Gotcha. That's a good reason to get in the fight. So I guess to lay the foundation for this conversation about the 1970 strike, which I've been reading about from a book that Tyler actually recommended. The book is called Undelivered: From the Great Postal Strike of 1970 to the Manufactured Crisis of the U.S. Postal Service. I regretfully have not been able to finish it before this interview, so you'll have to forgive my ignorance on some of the stuff. But why is it important to learn this history, generally speaking? Why should I, if I'm just a union member, in general, why should I care about this history? But particularly if I'm a letter carrier, why should I know about this strike that happened in 1970?
Well, to start off with, if you're a union member in this country, the postal strike of 1970 is one of the greatest moments, I think, in the entire labor movement in this country. You saw a group of hundreds of thousands of workers go on strike, topple not only their recalcitrant union leaders at the top, but also defeat Richard Nixon. At the time, very right wing, many parallels to our administration coming in today. It's the largest Wildcat strike in U.S. history. As a letter carrier, it's the most important strike in our union's history. It's the event that turned the NALC into a real union, a union with full collective bargaining rights, a union that had previously been at the mercy of Congress into a fighting democratic worker organization. It turned the letter carrier craft and postal worker crafts in general into a stable middle-class job, something that you could raise a family on. It is the defining event in postal union history, in my opinion.
And what would you say? Let's start with the strike. Let's get an overview of the strike then. What was the context for the 1970 strike? The strikes never just happen. They don't just come out of nowhere, and particularly strikes that are at least technically illegal don't come out of nowhere, right? These things require a context to happen. They don't just fall out of coconut trees. Forgive the expression. So what was the context for the 1970 postal strike?
So we're looking at the late 60s leading into 1970. There was, rampant inflation, 4 or 5% a year. The Vietnam War was raging. There was an upsurge in feminist struggle, the second wave feminist movement. There were all kinds of social movements. There was obviously the civil rights and the Black Power movements going on. I think in 1970, there was something like 1/6 of union members had gone on strike. So there was a general atmosphere of combativity, of ordinary people fighting against exploitation, fighting against their oppression, organizing, coming together. And at the same time, letter carriers saw that their union wasn't fighting for them, that they weren't actually making progress. At the time, it's very important to keep in mind that the United States Postal Service didn't exist. We were working under the United States Post Office Department, a federal agency. Our boss was Congress. We had to rely on Congress to get any increases in wages and benefits. And as I'm sure everybody here can probably guess, we didn't get many many wage increases back then. Between 1925 and 1943, there were no wage increases at all. And so at the time of the strike, a letter carrier was making something like $6,170 per year. And after 21 years to reach top pay, they would make around $8,000, which translates roughly to between $50,000 adjusted for inflation and $68,000. The contract had no enforcement mechanisms. Management ran roughshod. Letter carriers worked in outdated buildings with no heating or air conditioning in most of the time. And many letter carriers were forced to go on welfare or work second or third jobs just to get by. And so there was a tremendous amount of built up anger and frustration, but with no way to address it because striking was illegal. But nevertheless, there was activity, there was movement. In the late 60s, in 1968, several of the postal unions at the time had rescinded the no strike clause from their constitutions. They had organized sickouts in July of 1969. They'd organized marches in Washington, D.C. and outside post offices to demand a pay increase. And all of this activity went unnoticed by both the official national leaders of the union, the president, the secretary of labor. Postal workers were referred to in that time as the dependable men in gray, sort of invisible, people who would just take it, who just mail, keep quiet, etc. And lo and behold, in a few months, in March of 1970, they changed the world. They did something historic. They went out on strike. They struck against the federal government.
You know, when I read your article, you wrote an article about this. The title is "The Great Postal Strike of 1970: Lessons for Today." You can Google that title and it should come up. That stat that you just said, that the equivalent of the wages were starting at $50,000 a year and topped out at $68,000 a year. What really struck me was how much higher that starting wage is than it is today, and how, I mean, the starting wage today is something like $41,000 or $42,000 a year, and the idea that $50,000 a year could be a low enough starting wage to provoke such intense action, I think speaks to the raised expectations of workers in that era and the lowered expectations of workers in this era. I mean, if you were to take the current pay scale back 50 years, I think a lot of them would be appalled. I mean, the top out is higher. The top out is now like 84,000 or something, or 80,000. But it takes 15 years to get there, or 15 if you count the CCA. And so, but the starting wage being 20% lower approximately is just really astounding to me. What do you make of that? I mean, does that track with your understanding of the history, that people's expectations were just so much higher back then?
It does, but I think the expectations have to be understood in the context of not just the social environment, because we've also seen in this recent period a rise in strikes, a rise in figures like Shawn Fain, not just striking, but then also speaking in the name of the working class as a whole, linking their struggle with all of the issues that we as working people face. And so I don't think it's just a question of sort of external factor, this social period. It's also a question of the leadership. And I think, unfortunately, in our union, and unfortunately in many other unions, although there are important exceptions, the past couple years, the past few decades have seen an acceptance of these lower expectations. business unionism. We have to, oh, the post office is losing $6 billion. Well, then what can we do? We have to make these concessions. We have to give up this money. Now, thankfully, that is starting to change. But I think that, when workers see that their union leaders are telling them, this is the best we can do, keep your head down, we can't fight, don't bother fighting. A lot of them, unfortunately, they get the message and they keep their heads down. And part of the reason why I'm involved in Build a Fighting NALC, the fundamental thing is to get people from looking at their feet to looking around at their other coworkers, to raise their confidence, to encourage them to fight. We're talking about the strike, but this applies to everything. The union is only as strong as it's felt. The union is not just a contract, a leadership structure, bylaws. Those things are necessary. The essence is the solidarity. The essence is the sense that we are together. If there's an issue that affects one of us, we're going to tackle it as a group, in a station, in a region, as a union of 300,000, whatever the scale might be. And so to answer your question shortly, I think, yes, unfortunately, that has been the case. But we are now engaged in a fight, not just in our union, but in unions across the country, in raising those expectations again. And I hope to be a part of that.
Part of the, there is one fellow in the chat that has been, today pretty regularly kind of deriding people who are voting no. And something that he said that surprised me was that he said that this fellow, it claims to have been in the union for 40 years and met Vincent Sombrado at a 1990 NALC convention and said that Sombrado was the best president the NALC has ever had. And now, so what do you make of that dissonance of being like enamored with this guy who was part of kind of the informal strike leadership and was elevated after a certain amount of time to the national leadership of the union by going on an illegal strike, and yet the same guy with this fact in his mind or this opinion in his mind is also saying we should vote yes on the tentative agreement. It's good enough. What do you make of that before we jump into this? Because when he said that, I was like, "Whoa, that's crazy. That is super not consistent."
Sure. So what I would say to that union brother or sister or whoever is that I understand why you look at Vincent Sombrado and you compare him to Brian Renfro and you think, well, geez, I don't know. We don't have a fighter like Sombrado in office. Maybe this is the best we can get. And what I would say to you is to put your trust in movements like Build a Fighting NALC, the concerned letter carriers. There are lots of people who are willing to fight. And as we've seen, our issue, our contract is gaining a lot of attention amongst our coworkers, amongst the public. And if we want a Sombrado figure to take over the union in the future, if we want to return, we have to fight now. So I would say, and that fight consists principally right now in voting no. But I certainly understand comparing Sombrado to Renfro is, that's no contest.
And so back to 1970, we talked about the context, but typically there's like a trigger. You can. It's important to kind of have the dry field that's ready for a fire, but you have to have something to trigger it. What was the thing that finally got workers in contravention of U.S. law, in defiance of their national union leadership, to go out on strike? What was the inciting event?
So the strike was started in New York City among carriers in Branch 36. That was where Vincent Sombrado was working as a letter carrier. In the lead up to the strike, I mentioned this just previously, in July 1969, and Sombrado references as a dress rehearsal for the strike, there were letter carriers, but also mail handlers in what was then the Manhattan Bronx Postal Union, who were tired of waiting. They had voted their convention. If we're not getting a contract by July 1st, we're going to sick out. Something like 60 of them did. And postal management came down on them really hard, said, we don't want to pay them. We want to fire them. And the leadership at the time, both of the letter carriers and MBPU, kind of dragged their feet, kind of like, we're not gonna defend these guys. And so a rank and file grouping cohered, which said, no, we're going to defend these people. They are our people. We're going to get their jobs back. We're going to get them back pay. And it seems like a small issue, this, 60 carriers, not that much. But in Sombrado's own testimony, he said that was the dress rehearsal. That was when we came together. And other material from the time suggests that in the summer of 69, so before March of 1970, this grouping of rank and file letter carriers in Branch 36, but also in the Manhattan Bronx Postal Union, they started to meet. They started to come together. They were part of softball leagues, bowling leagues. There was a much greater sense of social cohesion. They knew each other. They spoke to each other, and they agreed, we have to strike. We cannot just rely on Congress anymore. We have to risk it. We have to go forward. We have to push our union. And in the meetings, the general membership meetings, which happen in every union, leading up to March 1970, you see them get bigger and bigger, from 20 people to 50 to hundreds, really battering down the walls set up by the existing union leadership, insisting we need to discuss striking. We need to do this. We need to do this. And that pressure built up and built up and built up. And then they learned the news that in his federal report, President Nixon at the time said, the 5% wage increase that I promised, I'm going to freeze that. And also their union president, the national president, James Rademacher, they learned that he had been in secret negotiations to couple a raise, I think it was like 5.4%, with postal corporatization, which would rescind the protection of being a federal civil service employee. And when those two things happened in my mind, it set off the powder keg. And then, fast forward to March. I think the strike started on the March 18th. A couple days before that, they packed their union hall. They voted something like 1,500 to 1,000 were going on strike. Their local president, Gus Johnson at the time, was insistent that they not do that. But by then, the tide had overflowed. And both clerks, basically mail handlers, and letter carriers came together. This was not just a strike by letter carriers. It was a strike by all postal workers. And that was essential to the strike's success. But it originated in New York City and then just spread like wildfire across the country.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
And so how did, as workers, rank and file workers, decided to, take this into their own hands and strike in defiance of the law and their union leaders, how did the government and their union leaders react? So,
as you might be surprised to know, in the first couple of days of the strike, Nixon apparently didn't pay any attention. The Vietnam War was going on, but I think more so there was the sense that, well, this thing can't actually spread. The Postal Department had actually provided a contingency plan to bring in the National Guard before Nixon did. And their whole assumption was, well, we know that these rabble-rousers in New York City, if they go on strike, we'll send the troops in, we'll crush it, nobody else will follow them. That was their biggest mistake. The union leaders, for their part, Rademacher was terrified because he had lost control of the union temporarily. He quickly began calling for branch presidents across the country to come to D.C., where the headquarters was, to insist that they urge their members to go back to work. Now, again, the strike is illegal, but I think it's important to also point out the consequences for striking. You could receive a $1,000 fine. You could go to jail. It wasn't just about, obviously you could lose your job, but there were high stakes, and there was tremendous pressure after a few days, tremendous pressure brought to bear on Rademacher to get people back to work. But by then, the momentum, the solidarity, the power, and the determination of letter carriers meant that essentially Branch 36 replaced Rademacher and the national apparatus as the real leaders of the union in the eyes of most letter carriers and most postal workers. So eventually Nixon does bring in the troops. That is a farcical flop. They are unable to move the mail. Many strikers were National Guard or veterans themselves, but they were totally unprepared. And when the strike spread, particularly to very important logistical nodes like Chicago, Los Angeles, By the way, there are hundreds of cities and towns across the country where people went on strike. Towns of a couple hundred people. 671 post offices went on strike. So while emphasizing these nodes, it's important to also say this was a truly national strike. And many people, or many postal workers, didn't vote. They just instinctively stood with their brothers and sisters in New York City. I remember when I was writing this, I came across a story of an oral history of how the debate in the local union hall went in, I believe it was like New Haven, Connecticut, or somewhere around there. And this letter carrier at the time is referencing all the debates, the reasons for and against. And at one point in the meeting, it's running long. It's been hours and hours. One guy just gets up and says, look, are we with our brothers and sisters in New York or not? And that that was the fundamental question. Are we with our brothers and sisters in this union or not? And fortunately, many letter carriers answered yes, and risked quite a bit to ensure that the strike spread and therefore succeeded.
Up to eventually approximately 200,000 postal workers went out on strike, according to Rubio in his book, at least. I think the Postal Service has an estimate of 150,000, and then I think Sombrado was the person with the more generous estimate. I think that he had like an estimate of 220 or 230. I think Rubio kind of comes down in the middle, thinks it was something more like 200,000. But any of those three is a really impressive number of people to have gone out on strike against one institution that it was illegal to go on strike against. I mean, really impressive display of solidarity there. And you mentioned the National Guards not being able to move the mail. I was struck by Rubio's recounting of public sentiment and how polls showed something like 8 in 10 Americans supporting the strike. Very similar numbers to what you saw during the UPS contract negotiations and the UAW contract negotiations. And there was at least a couple of testimonies of National Guardsmen expressing solidarity, like as they're being bussed in, hollering out the bus, like, don't worry, we're not doing any good in there. And at least a couple of instances of what seemed to be sabotage on the part of the National Guard, like purposely not doing a good job because they did not enjoy, being called on to break a strike. When you join the National Guard, people typically have this idea of like, I am going to guard the nation, right? I am going to be a protector of my country and my people and my neighbors, not I am going to be used as a weapon of the boss to undercut my neighbors. Like that's typically, that's just not what people get into the Guard for, right? And so I thought that was interesting. What did you make of like the public's reaction and some of those collections of responses from the National Guard themselves?
Sure. So I think then as now, the public supported letter carriers and postal workers because they interact with them every day. We deliver people's medicine. We deliver their Social Security checks. For elderly people, we might be the only people they see every day. And we're out there, raining, blizzard, heat, whatever. We're going to get to your door. We're going to talk to you. We create a sense of community with people. And I think also at the time as well, those inflation numbers, and the fact that many of the postal workers had served in the Vietnam War. I think it was something like a fourth of letter carriers across the country were, recently in the armed services. People understood that the letter carriers were, not just at their doors, but also, were suffering the same kinds of economic hardship that they were, very similar to today. If I talk to anybody about inflation, they get it. If they're working class, if they're working, they understand. I don't have to go into the details of the contract to say 1.3%. Their eyes get wide. So I think, broadly, there was a broadly shared experience amongst working people in this country that helped build a sense of solidarity. And then with the stories about the federal workers trying to move the mail and the sabotage, again, speaks to the fundamental solidarity between working people that, in my opinion, always exists. is not always given the full expression and organization that it deserves, but it's always there. These National Guardsmen, this was a time, by the way, in the late 60s, 70s, when the U.S. military would encourage coup d'etats in many countries across the world. In South America, one strike veteran in the book by Rubio recounts how, when he was on the picket lines in New York City, he was telling his coworkers, like, I remember this is the kind of stuff we see going on in the South American countries, and it's here in New York City. And I think those National Guardsmen also had that consciousness. They also had that awareness. They didn't want to be used by Nixon in this way fundamentally. And there Nixon overplayed his hand. And so all of these, these tools of the state machine, the National Guard, the Army, et cetera, seem very imposing. But at the end of the day, most of those people, then as now, are just like us. They're working people. They're struggling to survive. Right. And if you can connect with them on that basis, which the strikers did in 1970, you can overcome a seemingly unstoppable foe like the U.S. military by undermining it from within. And I think that is very important today. We're not facing the U.S. military right now. Thankfully, they're not trying to break or move the mail. But that solidarity, that is our most powerful weapon as working class people. But yeah, no, the stories in the book, and I really encourage people, please read the book. There's really great stuff in there related to that and other sort of anecdotal stuff that really gets across the spirit that carried the strike.
Right. And so how did the strike end, and what did they win from the strike, and did they lose anything?
Sure. So the strike starts on Wednesday, March 18th. It spreads in a very uneven character. The union is basically at the mercy of the rank and file. By the weekend, so that's a Tuesday, by the weekend, Rademacher had announced a deal. He had announced that we've got a deal with George Shultz, the labor secretary. We got it all sorted out. Just go back to work. And many strikers, like in New York and other places, said, no, we're not going to just trust your word on it. But then, some people did, or some cities, some regions did. And so you saw an uneven process of people slowly but surely across the country going back to work. Rademacher promised that, if the strike lasted one more week, he would lead a strike himself. I don't think I buy that. But many postal workers at the time were willing to give him a chance, and it's understandable. He was the union president at the time. And so by, I think it was March 26th or 27th, so it was 9 days, the strike formally ends. Everybody goes back to work. There was the agreement was a 12% wage increase, the right to collectively bargain, which was key because you didn't have that right, full paid health benefits, and amnesty for all the people who went on strike. So not a single letter carrier was fired. Nobody faced fines. Nobody faced jail time. And that was, again, because of the solidarity. Mass collective action is what protects us the most. Not the law, not appealing to managers, but demonstrating in action that we are willing to stand up with our brothers and sisters. Eventually, that package was ratified in the Postal Reorganization Act. So an act of Congress had to be passed. It took about a year. But they gained 14% wage increases, the right to collectively bargain. The post office department was transformed into the postal service. And the key concession was the right to strike. And so instead we got interest binding arbitration, which is what we have now, which is when negotiations break down, a series of arbitrators, one for the union, one for management, one neutral, come together and decide the details of the contract. And that is, unfortunately, I think, a concession that has haunted our union to this day.
Right. Yes, not having the right to strike, severely undermines your position at the bargaining table. And so what were, you mentioned that the strike was kind of a key thing in making the union, more of an institution that was in control of its members and fought for its members. What specifically about the NALC and the other postal unions changed in the aftermath of the strike, and why did the strike invoke those changes?
So the strike, there were thousands and thousands of unnamed militants, people who maybe for the first time during the course of the strike had to step up and convince their coworkers in break rooms, in parking lots, in diners all across the country, we should take this action. And that formed the basis for a broad layer of union militants within the NALC and the other postal workers unions that cohered, that continued the fight, that eventually won, in the case of the NALC, one member, one vote, so that they could vote for their president. It propelled the Sombrado administration into power. In the case of the clerks, the unions merged into the APWU as we know it today. And they sort of cohered behind this guy, Mo Biller. And so the APWU and the NALC became very strong unions that worked in tandem all the way through up until the 1980s and 90s to not just transform the unions democratically, but also to insist that they work together, that they bargain together. They even threatened to go on strike again in 1981, I think just before the PATCO strike. So, from unions that, didn't have the right to collectively bargain, no grievance process, management in complete control within 10 years, with the catalyst being this strike and the experience that all of those people went on strike gained, the confidence, the organizing skills they learned. Within 10 years, they'd become one of the most powerful, most militant groupings of unions in the whole country. And then, unfortunately, over the years, that those traditions were gradually lost. And so, our task, I think, in studying the strike, in studying all of the moments of our history, of the broader history of the American labor movement, is to rediscover that spirit that looks to the rank and file as the engine that drives the union forward. We need leaders. We need good leaders. But if we're not making the union a force that the rank and file feel on the workroom floor, day in and day out, if our activity is not organizing them, empowering them, encouraging them to solve their problems collectively, then we will not be able to transform this union, unfortunately.
And so bringing the conversation up to today, you have a tentative agreement from the union that many postal workers are saying that they're going to vote no on. And Build a Fighting NALC has a campaign to fight for the right to strike. And so there's a lot of discontent. I think that some people have been surprised by how broad the outcry from postal workers has been during this period of TA negotiations, but in particular after the release of the tentative agreement, and so. There's something of a powder keg here, and can you just remind us about the state of postal work today? What is the context that postal workers? What is the context under which postal workers received this tentative agreement that, again, many are saying is not enough?
So our contract expired back in May of 2023. It's been well over, I don't know what it is now, 500, 550 days without a contract. Since February of 2020, inflation has gone up roughly 20%. And of all the professions calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, postal workers are the ones whose pay has kept up the least relative to inflation since, I think, 2013. So already we have been facing the issue of our pay just not keeping up. There was the introduction of multiple wage tiers, the CCA position, Table 2. I won't go into too much detail, but in essence, what you create is a workforce of letter carriers who all do the same job. They all organize the mail. They all deliver the mail. They're all working under the same conditions. And yet, based on when you joined, you might be making up to $10 an hour more less than somebody who's working right next to you in the morning when you're in the office. Our compliance on the contract has been horrendous. I mean, Corey Walton emphasizes this rightly. I mean, there are just hundreds, thousands of grievance backlog case of grievances that just haven't been filed. The post office loses hundreds of millions because they just refuse to carry through the contract. The job has become much more physical. You know, as the volume of letters has decreased, which it has, it's overemphasized, I think, in the media broadly, but the package volume has increased. So you're lifting more. You know, it's a greater toll on the body. So people were really looking forward to this contract. Renfro, our president, emphasized that, you know, we worked through the pandemic. We got no hazard pay. We've been through this period of historically sharp increases in inflation. This was going to be a historic contract. And instead, he offered us, or he negotiated a contract that has a 1.3% wage increase per year over 3 years, you know, some paltry increases here and there. You know, instead of higher wages, we get the right to work overtime at 2.5 times our base pay after 60 hours. None of us want to work more overtime. We want higher pay so we can work less overtime.
Right.
And all of this is exacerbating the long-term crisis of staffing. We work in postal vehicles that have been around since the 1980s. They break down all the time in the middle of the road. The electrical catches on fire. And I think right now postal workers they're fed up. And I would encourage you, if you are a postal worker right now, if you're a letter carrier, vote no on this contract. And when you get your ballot in the mail very soon, encourage everybody else to vote no. We got to vote this thing down. This is not just about pay. It's about what that pay reflects. It's about dignity. It's about our fundamental worth as human beings who work for a living. We got to tell them, no, we're not going to take this. There are risks in arbitration, but that's why we should vote no, organize contract rallies, build this sense of public pressure. That the public is behind us. They don't fully know. They're not fully aware of what we're up against. But if we can make our voices heard, I'm confident that we can win at least a better contract than this.
There's a really good More Perfect Union video that came out recently about this, that talked about some of the struggles that letter carriers are having. They talked about some letter carriers living in their cars. They talked about some union halls installing showers because the employees, their members, didn't have enough time to take a shower at home. It was easier to do it at the union hall. And you talked about the grievance backlog. I was at the letter carriers hall here in Huntsville for a while, and was talking to one of the stewards, and he showed me this huge file of grievances, and he was like, this is just, I mean, it was like this thick. It had to have been over hundreds and hundreds of grievances. And he said something like, this is just in the last 3 months or something. It was insane. I can't remember exactly how, but it was in a relatively short time span, hundreds of grievances, like just from his post office. And it's like, why violate the law? Why violate your contract that much? It just doesn't make any sense. And so what are the, to underscore the point, what are the things that you think letter carriers today should learn from their forefathers that went on strike in 1970? What are the lessons that if you had, there are letter carriers that are listening to this, if they take nothing else away from this conversation, everything else goes out their ears, what do you think the key should be, the key takeaway from the 1970 postal strike should be?
When we come together as letter carriers, when we organize together, when we fully embody the principle that an injury to one is an injury to all, there is no force, whether it be our national leadership, whether it be the president of the United States, who can stop us from correcting the problems in our union. A lot of letter carriers, understandably, look to the Trump administration, look to DeJoy, look to the forces that want to privatize the union. The post office, that want to turn this into a minimum wage job, and they think, oh God, they got all the power in the world. But we have not just an equal, but a greater power in each other, in organization in movements like Build a Fighting NALC, the Concerned Letter Carriers, etc., we can take back our union and we can, again, embody it in practice day in and day out. If we work together to face the issues, whatever they may be in your station, in your local, I believe at least that there's nothing that can stop us, and we can return this union. If they were able to strike illegally, overcome 30,000 federal troops trying to break a strike, we can certainly overcome the concessionary contracts that give us. We can return this job to what it once was, a stable middle-class job to provide the kind of pay and benefits you can raise a family on. There is nothing stopping us. We just have to rediscover that fundamental tenet of the labor movement, which is that our solidarity, not just in words, not just in resolutions, but day to day, every day on the workroom floor. If we rediscover that, if we rekindle it, if we organize, if we harness that, there's nothing that can stop us.
What is the latest on the TA? You know, at one point, my understanding was that ballots were supposed to have been sent out in like mid-November, but I haven't heard anything about. I haven't even heard of people receiving their ballots yet. What's the latest on that?
So I haven't received my ballot. I haven't heard of anybody else receiving their ballot. There's a tremendous amount of activity. And I want to say thank you for providing a platform for us, Corey Walton, Tyler, myself, others, going on, people educating themselves, letter carriers, just spontaneously leafleting their stations. But currently, no details on when we're going to get our ballots. But that's kind of in line with this whole contract. I mean, we were hearing, just another week longer for something like 500 days now. So, but hopefully soon. And Build a Fighting NALC is going to encourage anybody, and anybody listening should, don't just vote no as individual, vote no, and then talk to your coworkers. We've been organizing vote no photos in the parking lot, in the station, if you can do that. We want to overcome a sense of pessimism. We want people to feel like we're voting no together. Because I think there might be a lot of letter carriers who are like, geez, if I vote no, is anybody going to vote no with me? There doesn't seem to be a tradition of talking about the contract. Listen to the people who want to vote yes. Listen to their arguments. Try to organize discussions. Whether it's just before people clock in or just after work, wherever you can. And so, yeah, we're waiting for ballots to drop, but there'll be more material on the Build a Fighting NALC website. I'm sure the CLC is doing stuff. They've organized vote no resolutions in some of their locals, which is fantastic. I'd encourage that. The key thing is we want letter carriers to come together. We want to be discussing these things together. We want to break the tradition of everybody just siloed, thinking about their issues, not engaging each other. But yeah, hopefully the ballots will drop soon and we can vote this thing down.
And so, assuming, and so that's kind of bunkers. You're hoping soon, but you don't know when the ballots will be mailed out or when they'll be counted. That's pretty wild. But assuming that a no vote happens, assuming that a majority of the NALC votes no, which I would be my assumption based on the feedback that people are giving us. What happens next?
So if this contract is voted down, it would give 15 days to negotiate a new one. There'd be a negotiation period of 15 days. If a contract was not settled in that time period, it would go to interest binding arbitration, in which there would be 3 arbitrators, one for the union, one for management, and then a neutral arbitrator that would decide the issues of the contract. And in my opinion, it would be our task to build as much pressure as possible from every possible angle to ensure that neutral arbitrator does the right thing and gives us a contract that we deserve. We don't have the right to strike. It's very unfortunate. We look at the labor movement more broadly. There are postal workers in Canada going on strike. We need that weapon. We do. It's our most powerful weapon, the ability to withhold our labor. But right now, if we organize a vote no campaign, if we get it voted down, if we put pressure on these arbitrators to do the right thing, that can translate, that can be a stepping stone towards a movement to eventually recapture that right to strike, which, we're going to need for future contracts, in my opinion, but we're also going to need to defend our job if the forces of privatization decide to strike a blow. So, we'll go to arbitration, and, we'll just have to do everything we can, rally, organize, etc. And I think we can be successful because, that arbitrator, the neutral arbitrator, our arbitrator, we have a great case. The arbitrators themselves, there's been some misinformation about, well, the post office has lost money or is declaring a loss of $6 billion last year and now $9 billion this year. Are the arbitrators going to look at that and say, well, we can't give you more? In the language that set up the arbitration mechanism in the Post Reorganization Act, there is no language to guide the arbitrators to say, well, if the post office is losing money, you have to take it into the account. The only, as far as I'm aware, the language is that they have to compare the post office with comparable private industry. That is the standard that they're given, not whether the post office is, they're not in charge of balancing the post office's books. So I think we're in a strong position in arbitration, actually. But yeah, that is all to come. The first step, though, is make sure we vote this thing down.
All right. Rob Darakjian, NALC Branch 2902. Appreciate your time. Coordinating Committee of the Bill Defining NALC. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this morning.
Likewise. Thank you, Jacob. Take care.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.